Hey everybody, welcome back. Just got to thinking with everything that's going on, lots of people are uncertain about things, they don't know what to do. People want the facts, people want to know what's going on, people want to know the truth. And maybe that's not always easy to get, or people don't know exactly where to get their information from. You trust the people on the left, CNN, you trust the people on the right, Fox News, somewhere in the middle, the truth. And people want the truth because you can use that to guide your next decision. You can use that as your guide. You can use that, for example, as a compass. If you know where north is, you can figure out, if you want to go east, you want to go west, whatever, you hold the compass, you figure out where you want to go. You can characterize truth as like an anchor on a ship. If you're out at sea in the middle of a storm, maybe you can put down your anchor and that'll hold you into position until the storm blows over. You're not going to get swept out to sea by something false, maybe. It's going to lead you down to a worse path than where you already are, and you're not going to know where you're at. Truth is really important in that way, that it's going to show you where to go. It's going to give you something reliable. It's going to give you something consistent. And so something that I was thinking about with this whole coronavirus thing and riots and everything else, people want to know what's true so they can make their decision. It has lots of ramifications to know what the truth is. And I thought that this would be a good springboard to go off of into the topic of something else that has a lot of, if it were true, which obviously I believe it as a Christian, but the crucifixion of Jesus Christ and his resurrection and the time of when he was on earth, if that's true. I got done reading The Case for Christ, which is a book that came out in like 1998. It's been around a long time. It goes through different facts and it goes through different evidence presenting the case for if Jesus Christ really existed, died on the cross, and rose again from the dead. It gives a evidence-based perspective on if that all really could have happened and did happen. And then it leads you to, okay, if that happened and if that was true, what do you do with it now? And I thought that would be a good topic based on, talking about truth, springboarding to that, where if that is true, what do you do with it? And I think that's something that is a big topic, because I think there's lots of facts and evidence around it that lots of people overlook or don't know about. And I think it would be a really good topic to get into. So I thought for the next series of videos, I would go into the different chapters of The Case for Christ and bring out questions that, have been common questions that some people have, or when he goes through in the book is the points where lots of people dispute if Christ really existed or not, or the different things that he did or didn't do. All the contested points, all the contested questions or controversies. And I thought it would be really interesting and a good idea to go through that. So, and I think a lot of people would take something back from, or take something with them from that. So, yeah, let's see what we learn. Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to the studio, where we're out of the sun. We get a nice breeze going. Hopefully you can hear me a little bit better. Yeah, let's get into the meat and potatoes of the subject at hand. And yeah, let's see what we learn. I don't know about you guys, but I'm running a little bit low here on my coffee, so I'm gonna make another batch and give me 2 minutes. We'll meet up here again and we'll get going. Sound good? All right. Alrighty, so we're back. We got our coffee. We're all set to go. I wanted to get into The Case for Christ and just give you a little bit of background about the book. It's written by Lee Strobel. It came out in 1998 or so. There's been a movie on it. That was in 2017. Lee Strobel he was an investigative journalist he's still alive, but he was an investigative journalist for the Chicago Tribune back in the 80s he was an atheist, and his wife became a Christian, and he notices some changes with her that really surprised him, and so he went out and he did an investigation. He conducted his own investigation on the validity of the story of Christ and the New Testament, the New Testament Gospels. So he goes into that, and everything that he documented, he shares in this book. And he later became a Christian. His investigation took about 2 years or so, about there. And then he was so convinced and compelled by the evidence thereafter that he converted to Christianity. He became a Christian then. So it was a pretty interesting and powerful book. But yeah, let's get into it then. So this is chapter 1, the episode 1 of the little mini-series here on The Case for Christ. In chapter 1, Lee Strobel has an interview with Craig L. Blumberg, and the chapter is titled, "The Eyewitness Evidence, Can the Biographies of Jesus Be Trusted?" So the Gospels are 4 different books in the New Testament, which partially describe the life of Jesus when he was on earth. They record miracles, they record conversations between him and Jewish officials and Pontius Pilate, so forth. They describe about roughly 3 years of his life and his ministry leading up to his death on the cross, and then shortly thereafter the resurrection and the ascension. So the Gospels themselves are anonymous, but tradition and testament of the early church reports that Matthew, the book of Matthew, was written by Levi the tax collector, who was also a disciple of Jesus. Mark was written by John Mark, a disciple of Peter. So you kind of get Peter's perspective through the book of Mark. Luke was written by a physician who was a disciple of the Apostle Paul. And the book of John was written by John, who was the son of Zebedee. So all the Gospels are based on either direct or indirect eyewitness testimony. You have, for example, the books of Matthew and John, who are both disciples of Jesus. Those would be the direct eyewitness testimony. And you have Mark and Luke, which would be the indirect eyewitness testimony. It's interesting to point out that the authors of Matthew, Mark, and Luke were all individuals who didn't really have any high status or anything in Jesus' circle. They would be viewed as non-important. Like Matthew was a tax collector. Levi was his other name. Tax collectors were in those times were viewed as traitors because they did the bidding of the Romans. They collected all the taxes, and they were often corrupt or seen as corrupt. And so they were kind of outcasts. They weren't seen as they were seen as useful by the Romans, and by the other fellow Jews, they didn't really care for them. They weren't to be trusted. So Luke wasn't even a disciple of Jesus, so that kind of rules out the possibility that somebody just kind of made that up, because why would you make up a gospel when it was attributed to somebody who wasn't even Jesus' disciple? The same thing is true with Mark, written by, like I said before, John Mark, a disciple and companion of Peter. So that's also, why would you falsify something made up by somebody who's not even in Jesus' inner circle? So that's just something to kind of point out in contrast with like the apocryphal Gospels, where it says, okay, this was written by Philip, this was written by Peter, this was written by James, and these are all people who have higher status, who would have had higher statuses in Jesus' circle and would kind of be viewed as a more prominent witness, if you say. So a higher suspect of falsifying information then. So one of the most oldest and significant testimonies that we have concerning the Gospels and their authorship was from a guy named Papias, about AD 125. Another prominent testimony that we have about the Gospels is from a guy named Arrhenius. That was in about AD 180. And he confirmed the traditional authorship of the Gospels. And it's interesting to note that he learned from a guy named Polycarp, and Polycarp was a disciple of the Apostle John. So, you know, if it's important to you to trace back, okay, where did this guy get this information? Okay, it goes right back from Irenaeus to Polycarp to John the Apostle to Jesus himself. So it's good to note where that comes from. So in this way, when you look at the authors or who authored the Gospels, you can see where you have the direct or indirect eyewitness testimony. You actually had people who were there on the ground talking about it, or you heard a direct, an indirect testimony of somebody who was there, who was boots on the ground, so to say. So essentially the Gospels are biographies of Jesus. Biographies in those times, so when you look at the Gospels, they're different in how you would view a biography today, like when you think of George Washington, where it has equal emphasis on his birth, his life, and then his death, and then maybe it'll have the importances of his contributions to society or history or whatever. In the Old Testament Gospels, you don't have that. You have, and there's two different reasons quoted by Lee Strobel here. One was a literary purpose or difference. They didn't quote word for word, or biographies they didn't find it necessary to quote word for word what somebody said. And they didn't also have to have equal representation of, equal parts of life, birth, life, and death. They reported the essence of a person. They reported the primary ideas and thoughts of a person, things that were important, things that changed or helped other people, and things that were really representative of history at that time. It's important and I think interesting to note that even in ancient Greek and Hebrew, they didn't even have symbols for quotation marks. So you wouldn't have any direct quotes because that didn't exist. You can't say, oh, okay, well, can you give me a direct quote of this guy? Well, they didn't even have symbols for quotation marks, so I think that's kind of interesting to point out. So when you talk about the Gospels, you might also hear of the mystery of Q, which I didn't know about this before reading the book either. It's kind of interesting. It's the mystery of Q is just essentially a theory that the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, two of the synoptic Gospels, drew from the earlier book of Mark, but they also contained information that wasn't present in Mark, and this information is theorized as Q, and Q is short for the German word Quelle, which means source. So that kind of makes sense. So it was a source of different information, and Q is essentially thought to be the sayings or teaching of Jesus, which may have formed an independent or separate document all in themselves. It's kind of like how you would view a best of or a best of album, or like a greatest hits album or something like that. Like you could say the best of Jesus' sayings. Okay, Josh, but you just said that Matthew drew on information from Mark. Matthew was a disciple of Jesus, Mark was not. Why would he do that? That doesn't make sense. However, it would make sense that if Matthew was drawing on information from Mark, Mark represents the experiences of Peter, who was a disciple of the inner circle of Jesus. So it would make sense that Matthew could go back and say, okay, did that really happen this way? I'm checking that to see if that worked. Okay, if that was that way. Okay, that does match up. But he would also draw on information from Mark, because Mark got that from Peter, who was also in the inner circle of Jesus. For example, the Transfiguration. There were only 3 disciples. It's recorded there was only 3 disciples present. Actually, in the book of Matthew, you can look that up. 3 disciples present with Jesus when he went on the mountain and was transfigured, and that would have been Peter, John, and James. John and James were the sons of Zebedee. So that's why Matthew would draw on information from Mark, for example. The synoptic gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Synoptic just means to view at the same time. And these are called that because of the similar outline and their interrelationship between one another. Okay, that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. What about John? John is a little bit different. The book of John only contains a handful of the common stories that are present in the other synoptic gospels, but it contains different terminology. It has more blatant claims of Jesus being God himself, being one with the Father, being the way, the truth, and the life, the resurrection and the life. That's how he characterizes Jesus, or Jesus characterizes himself in the book of John. And so the book of John is viewed as very independent of the other Gospels, but it also has very different choices of the material that's presented, and it provides a different perspective on Jesus. So the book of John was written later than the other synoptic gospels, and why is it so different than the other ones? It's postulated that didn't see any need to copy and repeat the same stories that the other 3 guys said, so he was going to supplement the information that they had to provide. So are there contradictions between John and the other gospels? In John chapter 8, verse 58, Jesus says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." And I am is an allusion to, for example, the story of Moses, when God tells Moses to go tell the Israelites in Egypt, "Yeah, I'm going to deliver you." Moses asks, "Well, okay, that's all great, but who am I going to tell them sent me?" And God says, "Tell them I am sent you," or "I am that I am." In John 8, chapter 58, Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." And so that's that reference to the God of the Old Testament. So that's one way. That's the way that John presents it. Okay, so that's John being directly and saying, "Okay, I am." Actually, in the books of Matthew and Mark, when you have the story of Jesus walking on the water and the disciples are in the storm, in English translations, it'll say, "Fear not, it is I," Jesus talking to the disciples. But in the Greek, it actually translates, "Fear not, I am." So you have that, element that's present in John, that's present in the Old Testament. So you do have references to the divinity of Jesus in those cases. But also you have in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus likes to refer to himself as the Son of Man, which this is something that I didn't understand for a long time either, but Son of Man essentially just means human. However, you might say, okay, well, that doesn't sound very divine at all. Okay, but Son of Man is a reference to another book in the Bible, the Old Testament, the book of Daniel. In the book of Daniel, chapter 13 through 14, we read, and this is a picture of a divine being. This is the picture of the coming Messiah. This is a picture of God himself. Okay, so you might say, okay, Josh, that's all fine and good and everything, but how long were the Gospels written after Jesus? It's a valid question. The standard dating, even among liberal circles of scholars and historians, is that the book of Mark was written first of all the Gospels in the 70s, 80. Matthew was written in the 80s, and the book of John was written in the 90s. That's still within the lifetime of various eyewitnesses who were around during the time of Jesus, including even hostile eyewitnesses who would have served as a correction if there was any false teachings going around at that time. But really, that's not long at all between that. When you think of if the crucifixion was in as early as AD 30, then you got a time of 30 years, 30 to 60 years after the time of Christ, which isn't very long. It sounds long, but I'll give you an example in contrast. The biographies of Alexander the Great. Okay, so you think of the great Alexander the Great, the famous Greek guy who conquered a whole bunch of the world. Biographies on him were written by individuals named Arrian and Plutarch, and that was more than 400 years after his death. He died in 323 BC, but yet historians generally hold these testimonies or these writings about him as trustworthy. Legends did pop up of Alexander, but that was after these books had already been written about him, and after these guys had already been dead. The guys who wrote the books on Alexander the Great. So in other words, the first 500 years of Alexander the Great, or his records and testimonies of him, were generally intact for the first 500 years after he died, and then some funky stories and legends started popping up afterwards. So contrast with the Gospels. So you got 100 to 500 years in contrast with 30 to 60 years. That's pretty impressive. That says a lot. So if you're still not convinced, you're still telling me, okay, 30 to 60 years. 30 years, if you say that's the earliest, is still a little bit too long for me. Okay, I got more for you. You have to remember that the books of the Bible, especially those in the New Testament, were not written chronologically. The Gospels were written after Paul. So the ministry of Paul began in the 40s, and most of his letters appear in the 50s, AD. So if you go to Paul and see if there's earlier information, you find out that you'll get creeds, confessions of faith from the earliest church, and these go all the way back to just after the resurrection. Another source of information concerning the testimony of Christ is written by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul tells us where he got all of his information from. So if you think of the crucifixion as being as early as AD 30, Paul's conversion is thought to be around 32 AD, so 2 years after, where Paul was brought to Damascus to a disciple named Ananias and some other disciples. This was after, you think of the famous story of Paul on the road to Damascus, where he saw a bright light, and he was blinded, and he was told by Jesus himself, or asked by Jesus himself, "Why are you persecuting me?" And he was sent to Ananias, and Ananias told him about Jesus Christ. And Paul meets up with the apostles, those who are in Jesus' inner circle. That would have been about AD 35, so 5 years roughly after the death of Christ. The crucifixion. So at some point, Paul was given the creed, which has already been formulated in the early church. So you got to think, okay, 2 years into it, Paul would have been converted. So some point between the 2 years and the 5 years when he talks to the other disciples, he had already gotten information about these creeds and everything else concerning the testimony, concerning the life and death and resurrection and ascension of Christ. So yeah, that was episode 1. lots of stuff to go in that we went through. I hope that it was all understandable for you guys. I had about 4 pages of notes, 6 pages of notes written, and 4 pages of notes typed in the computer here. I hope that it was interesting information for you, and I hope that you had a little bit of fun. You maybe heard a new perspective on things or learned something that you didn't know before. All of this, just as a kind of disclaimer, all of this information, if not all this information, most of it, if not all, I got this from the book, The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. There's some extra sources I'll provide as well that Lee Strobel provides himself. But yeah, all this information I got directly from his book. So yeah, like I said, I hope you had some fun with this and you get to learn something, and we'll keep going. Have a great day, and we'll catch you next time.